I mean, doesn't this type of education violate the Civil Rights Act? Because the Civil Rights Act technically was aiming to end discrimination like this. And I know that the 1619 Project / critical race theory narrative, I mean, really works on this type of discrimination. How does this get around the Civil Rights Act?
Well, I don't think it does. And I don't think that I think that no fair interpretation of the Civil Rights Act could find this doctrine anything other than offensive, false, and hateful. Now, we have become so politicized in this country, as I don't have to tell you, that the rule of law and the authority of the rule of law is diminishing in the face of political passion. So I think you're absolutely right. A fair reading of civil rights law would condemn this and make it illegal. We're not going to wait on the federal government. We're trying to do that here in Texas. Because the Biden administration's Department of Education just announced 2 weeks ago special grants for teaching, and they hold this up as an example, civics along the lines of the 1619 Project. If we don't pass this bill in Texas, what'll happen is the argument you always hear in state legislatures. Oh, look at all this money the federal government's going to give us. Are we going to say no to that? Right? And then they take it. Right? And they're corrupted in the process. That won't happen if this bill passes.
Now, one of the big contrasts, as you're mentioning, is kind of these two foundational education systems coming to a head in the United States. 1619 Project, New York Times, I mean, debunked reports, but it's being used as the framework for a lot of this. And the 1776 Project, which was the Trump administration kind of response to the 1619
Yes.
Project. Now, this 1619 Project is framed as anti-racist, and the 1776 Project is framed as racist. Now, let's go into these a bit. Let's start with the 1619 Project. People say it's anti-racist education. What would you say to that?
Oh, I would say it's racist education. Because when you say that, well, for example here, let me give you some examples from the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, because Chinese American citizens in this country are increasingly alarmed and upset over what's happening to them, specifically with quotas being established to get into good colleges. The Wall Street Journal wrote a piece on Asian Americans trying to get into Harvard and Yale, and the Wall Street Journal calls Asian Americans the new Jews. And by the new Jews, what they are referring to is the venomous, hateful policies of the Ivy League institutions in the 20s and 30s when they had quotas for Jews because they were too smart. Now that's being applied to Asian Americans. So the Chinese American Citizens Alliance has come to the conclusion and has published a report on critical race theory that I think really nails it. And what they say is that critical race theory is heavily influenced by people such as Marx, Lenin, Gramsci. But what they do is, for Marx, as he says, the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles. But then you got to the 40s and 50s and 60s in this country, and they said, that's not working because the American middle class is too big. Life is too good, right? So they replaced class struggle with race struggle and then gender. And that's how we got to this point. So under this, and here I'm quoting from the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, according to critical race theory, quote, "You are not a person. You are only your race, and by your race alone you will be judged. All unequal outcomes by race, or what the left calls inequity, are the result of racial oppression. All blacks are oppressed, and all whites are oppressors. This is systemic. Never ask whether oppression occurred. Only ask how it occurred." Now, and this is the worst of all, and it just shows how condescending and demeaning to African Americans critical race theory is. And this is why I say it is the new racism. Critical race theory defines whiteness, right? I mean, you might have heard Coca-Cola did that employee training telling their white employees try to be less white. This is why. Whiteness, according to critical race theory, is the belief in achievement, delayed gratification, deadlines, merit, race blindness, the written word, facts and objectivity, logic and reason, and mathematics and science. Now, this is no different. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan Grand Masters would gleefully agree with that description, right? And yet we're getting it from people who call themselves anti-racist. This is no different from the horrible minstrel shows they used to do in the 1840s, 1850s, in which they'd have white people, actors, in blackface, portraying blacks as buffoonish and lazy and shuffling. Now we're getting this from critical race theory, and it's called anti-racism. George Orwell is spinning in his grave, right? In the name of anti-racism, we are going to say that blacks do not believe in achievement or delayed gratification or logic and reason. Right? What does the world come to?
Well, and especially they're talking about they're saying that race blindness, that
Yes.
that the lack of looking at race is racist. How is not looking at the color of a person's skin considered racist?
Well, yeah. In fact, you're right. And the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, it's another summary point they have. If you are white and you won't admit that you're racist, then you are racist by implicit bias. Now, they do, CRT, critical race theory, has a way to reduce implicit bias. How? You must self-criticize, you must confess to privilege, and you must apologize to the oppressed race. And this is what's being taught increasingly to third graders.
Well, and that's terrifying for a lot of people I know who come from communist countries. I know a lot of Chinese Americans, friends of mine, who've compared a lot of what's happening in this country right now to what happened in China. You know, when they see people tearing down statues, you know what they think? They think Red Guard.
Right.
Little Red Guard.
And rightly so.
Tearing down the statues of China. When they hear about, for example, globalism, they think the First International, the Communist International. Yes. It's the same thing in the rise.
It is.
And when they hear this type of, criticizing yourself, they think these struggle sessions where people get together and they have to self-criticize. For them, it's the same thing.
Right.
But, what would you say to this? I mean, is this the same thing? Is this Marxism, basically, that was done in China or other countries?
Absolutely.
Being applied in different forms?
Absolutely. It is. It absolutely is. And it only grows more totalitarian in its purposes and effect every day. I hear every day from at least one family, we are pulling our kids out of our school. And they all say, it's a good school, we're in a good neighborhood. And here's the ironic thing. It's just like with the universities. The more elite the university is, the more crazy on critical race theory it is. Same thing with the K-12 schools. So they're getting it's. I'm hearing from parents at very expensive private schools up in Dallas, et cetera, who's saying, "I'm pulling my kids. I can't believe what they're doing."
Well, and some people would say, "Well, this is something enforced on the schools. It's not going to be like something in modern, full on in society where it's dictating every part of our society. It's just education."
Yeah, it's just education. There's a saying that is attributed to Lincoln, and I've never been able to find the source, but whoever said it, I think it speaks to this situation, and that is this. What is taught in the classroom in this generation will be practiced in the legislature in the next generation. And we're already starting to see that with millennials, et cetera, and we see what they've been taught, right? Favoring a majority, favoring socialism. I can tell you as a college professor who's been teaching since 1981, they have no idea what socialism is. Because universities don't teach it, except approvingly, which means not in detail. Because if you look at the 35 different experiments around the world throughout history in trying to abolish private property, the results are disastrous. Always have been.
How are they saying that the 1776 Project is racist, though? Because really it's just a study of the founding documents of America. How are they framing this?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good question. And I had the honor to be on the 1776 Commission, and I contributed to it. And a friend sent me a screenshot when it was released. The Chiron, the running scroll at the bottom of CNN News, it said, Trump administration releases racist 1776 report. Right? Now, I know how they can call it racist. The same way they can call critical race theory anti-racist. Right? If critical race theory is anti-racist, then the Declaration of Independence is racist. Because the Declaration of Independence calls for colorblind equality of opportunity. Critical race theory calls for color-conscious equality of outcome. You can have one or you can have the other, but you can't have both. Right? So that's the reason. Now, look, the argument that we made in the 1776 Commission report was simply this, that America consists of a flawed people but with noble aspirations. And that it's by those aspirations, specifically human equality and individual liberty, that we have judged ourselves over our entire history. Right? The only reason we talk about racial equality today is because we take it seriously, because we believe that all human beings are created equal. That's the central or primal truth of the Declaration of Independence. So it's a fascinating irony, because the very side that's arguing that you're racist knows that we, because we're not and don't want to be called racist, will bend over backwards to prove it. It's a bullying technique, right? There can't just be a disagreement to be resolved through facts and argument. Instead, if you disagree with me, it must be because you're a racist.
You know, what we're seeing here is that they're altering the definition of language. They're altering the definition of words in order to make what they call power words. Mao Zedong did this. They talked about power words. How do you take a concept and imbue it with revolutionary potential? The word superstition in China became a power word, where the word superstition, which was blind belief or belief, was made into something that was to be denigrated. And so, for example, if you believed in your teacher, that was blind belief. They were attacking and killing the teachers at the time.
Yes, they were.
If you believed in religion, that was blind belief. They were attacking and killing the priests at that time and the different monks and so on at that time.
Which they always do.
If you believed in traditional Chinese culture at that time, you were called a rightist. They had the four olds, the old beliefs and old religions and old cultures they were trying to destroy. This was taking language, altering the meaning of it, and then criticizing people based on the meaning of it.
That's right.
And it seems that they've altered the definition of racism in some ways in order to push what you've described again as actually something that is racist by the old definitions of it.
No, that's exactly right. And they've done the same thing with sex. In fact, the Biden administration just announced this morning that now they were going to be defining sex for purpose of governmental policy as gender identity.
You know, Orwell talked about this, the altering of the human language, and the way it could be used by tyrants is what he warned about.
Yes.
Specifically about Ingsoc, English socialism, in fact, right? A socialist system manipulating language, altering language in order to do things like make people believe two contradictory ideas and not seem to question the contradictions within them.
Yes, doublethink.
Yeah. Now, how do we see this manifesting right now with these types of theories that put
Well, we see this right now. I mean, as you point out to Orwell's book, which I recommend to all of your audience, even if they've read it before, read it again. I read it in high school, and then I just read it about 3 years ago, and Orwell, he nailed it. Freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and war is peace. Those were the three mottos of Ingsoc. All three, of course, are contradictions that require doublethink. Just as saying that calling all whites oppressors and all blacks oppressed is anti-racism. It requires doublethink.
And in the same way, they talk about 1 + 1 = 3, where you have to acknowledge something that you know to be false, which we can even look at, for example, the gender studies things are putting forward. You know it to be false, but you're forced to acknowledge it. It seems very similar, actually, these same tools being used.
Yes. You're absolutely right about that, Josh. And in fact, the Chinese American Citizens Alliance points to Seattle has adopted a curriculum called ethnomathematics. Ethnomathematics. And you brought up the point from 1984 where O'Brien holds up and says, how many fingers do you see, right? And then finally, Winston Smith sees 5. 2 + 2 = 5.
Oh, that's one. 2 + 2 = 5.
Right. And in fact, there was a math professor at an Ivy League school just wrote an op-ed 2 weeks ago that said, oh yeah, 2 + 2 = 5.
Really? They said this. Well, this is the crazy part that, you were talking about the different ways the different things it's calling racist, even logic and reason as being racist.
Yes.
I mean, and this is frightening for anyone who studied totalitarianism, because that was one of the things Mussolini did with fascism. Yes. He wanted people to think from what he called the reptilian brain, this instinctual, emotional thinking, rather than a logical form of thinking. And if they're trying to frame logic and reason and sound judgment really is racist, what is the alternative? And what kind of a society is that creating if they're teaching this to kids?
Exactly. Well, look, if you teach separatism, expect less understanding among the groups thus separated. If they don't understand each other and are separate from each other, expect more misunderstanding. From misunderstanding comes hostility, and from hostility comes violence. Seattle and Portland, right? This isn't theoretical. Right now, we're at a crossroads. Do we want all of the United States to become Seattle and Portland? Because if we allow critical race theory to be taught, it's over. It's over for America as founded. You can have the Declaration's doctrine of equality, and you can have the idea that all whites are oppressors and all blacks are oppressed, but you can't have them both together.
And this is one of the big flips around again with language. They're talking about equality, and we know the Declaration of Independence talks about, all men are created equal, right? People are created equal. But a different framing of the nature of equality itself. And the funny thing is they're not talking about equality anymore, they're talking about equity, equal outcome.
Yes. Oh, yeah, they don't talk about equality anymore.
So rather than equal rights that you are born with and that government is supposed to protect, not to go into and alter and play around with, which is the way things are heading with the changes proposed to the Constitution.
Yes.
Government regulating our rights rather than protecting our rights, and government regulating our rights specifically to create a certain outcome regardless of the effort you put in.
Exactly.
I mean, what is this doing, and where are we heading with this?
Well, I mean, what we're doing is destroying individual liberty, right? In fact, Chinese American Citizens Alliance talks about that. Justice for America under the Declaration is about equal rights, but social justice, or equity, is about equal outcomes. Because for critical race theory only social justice matters, justice under the Declaration of Independence does not. If you're going to achieve equal outcomes, you must forget equal rights. That's where we are, and that's what's going to happen.
Now,
and it's happening already.
You briefly mentioned dialectical materialism, which was the living soul of Marxism, as it was called. And funny enough, the foundation of Marxism that was used by the Catholic Church to excommunicate originally communists, because it said it focused specifically on sharpening the antagonisms between people. Mm-hmm. It focuses on sharpening antagonisms.
Yes.
If you could explain to us what dialectical materialism is and how it applies to this, what would you say to people?
Yeah. When Marx says in the first sentence of the manifesto, history of all hitherto existing societies is a history of class struggles, this is a presentation of the Marxist view of history, which constitutes a progress, and that all historical epochs have existed in a relationship between oppressor and oppressed. And through dialectical materialism, meaning through changes in the relations among the modes of economic production, we've moved and advanced from each age to the next. Now at capitalism, we are sort of on the precipice of the universal and homogeneous classless world society that Marxism envisions. It's through dialectical materialism, meaning through the working out of the contradictions in capitalism itself, that Marx is convinced communism will emerge from. So for the Marxists, we are in a stage of what's called late capitalism, meaning all of our contradictions are becoming apparent, and that's good for them because that will raise class consciousness, which means consciousness of oppression, and lead to the violent revolution that Marx insists is the only path to justice. Marx and Marxists had contempt for the socialists. They said, this goody-goody stuff and reform and a minimum wage. No. You don't want the workers to be satisfied with a little minimum wage increase, right? You want them conscious of oppression. Of course, that's what critical race theory does. It teaches kids to view the world as oppressors and oppressed, and to view themselves as, by virtue of their skin color, to be either an oppressor or oppressed.
And we see that now with the race narratives. Yeah. Now, I guess just last question. You're proposing, this bill is being proposed in Texas right now. I know you helped advise some of the different ideas that have been used in this, actually.
Yes.
And it's presenting not just a response to the 1619 Project and a critical race theory, but proposing something new in its place. I think based on the foundations of the 1776 Project. What does this aim to teach kids?
It aims to teach kids that has America suffered from racism? Yes. Are America's founding principles racist? No. They repudiate racism. That's the fundamental message, right? That it's not a whitewashing of history, right? Including the Lincoln-Douglas debates in the required curriculum under this bill. Students are going to learn a lot more about the injustices of slavery and its utter hypocrisy in the face of the principle of equality by reading Lincoln-Douglas debates. So this is not a whitewashing, but what it is saying is that racism is not who we are, right? Racial and sexual scapegoating are not who we are. That's all this bill tries to do.
Now, I guess, is there anything else you'd like to say when it comes to this argument right now? If you're to tell people, say, one thing about this conflict of education systems and why it matters. And also, a lot of people may feel hopeless. They may feel there's no chance against this. We do see states pushing back against it. What would you tell them?
I would tell them, please do not give up hope, because that's exactly the intention. It's exactly to make you think that you've been swept up by the tide of history and there's nothing you can do about it. So better to shut your mouth and smile and go along. Don't do that. Parents ask me all the time. I tell them, go to the school board meetings. Better yet, run for the school board. If you can't change your school, put your kids in a charter. You can afford a private course. Check out the private school first, because as I've said, they're some of the worst on this. Homeschool if you have to, right? Because your kids are going to be going away 7-8 hours a day, and they are going to come back having been taught to hate you and your country.
Hey, thanks again for being on Crossroads. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.